In November 1942, Italian and German radar detected strange movements in the vicinity of Gibraltar. At that time, the Third Reich was confident in its military capabilities, since its troops were advancing through Eastern Europe in the direction of Stalingrad, with the aim of seizing Soviet oil wells. On the other hand, the Allies had not managed to subdue the Nazi soldiers in North Africa, since they had run into General Erwin Rommel, who, based on ingenuity and strategy, had managed to contain his enemies. However, the maritime activity in Gibraltar was highly perplexing, and Italian intelligence agents asked the Germans to investigate the matter. Hitler refused the request, as Italy's war performance had been poor, and the Führer no longer had the patience to deal with Mussolini's meager forces. In the long run, this would prove to be a serious mistake, and it would mark the beginning of the end of the Nazi Empire. What the dictator did not know was that near Gibraltar there was a huge fleet of Anglo-American ships with more than 65,000 soldiers heading towards Tunisia, with the mission of taking over the Mediterranean Sea. The United States entered World War II at the end of 1941. From that moment on, the Soviet Union continued to pressure the Americans and the British to open a new battlefront in Western Europe so that the Nazis would have to divert resources from Russian territory. Meanwhile, the British and American governments had different ideas about the course of action to follow. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his military advisors believed that the conditions were not right for the liberation of continental Europe, since the U.S. troops were inexperienced and poorly organized. The United States, and especially General George Marshall, advocated disembarking their men in France as soon as possible. The British generals were convinced that if this happened, the brunt of the attack would fall on their shoulders, and the German retaliation would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of Englishmen, since Germany was closer to England than to the United States. Discussions between the two nations lasted for a few months, but they finally reached an agreement. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ignored his advisors, placed himself under the orders of England and ordered to help in the preparations to invade North Africa, with the aim of wresting the Mediterranean Sea from the Axis. The operative was codenamed Torch. Thus, General Marshall saw his plans to concentrate U.S. military efforts in the Pacific Ocean frustrated. Before continuing, we want to invite you to discover our new channel, MilitaryMight. Here we'll carry out in-depth analyses of the most powerful, modern, and surprising weapons of war in the world. So, if you like military weaponry, you must check out MilitaryMight. You'll find the link to the channel in the description and in the first comment. Let's go on now. Operation Torch was as risky as it was ambitious. It consisted of concentrating a massive fleet that would transport an army of 65,000 Americans and British to land in North Africa, where they would conquer the cities of Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca. To do this, they would have 350 warships and 500 common ships to transport different resources. The towns to be conquered were in possession of the Vichy regime, the puppet government that the Third Reich had imposed on France after occupying it in 1940. The Allies believed that the operation would be successful because Hitler's forces were concentrated in the Soviet Union, while the German soldiers of the Afrika Korps, under the command of Erwin Rommel, were too busy fighting the English in Egypt. Because of this, the path to victory was supposed to be clear, since the only ones who could give battle to the Allies would be the Vichy French. These troops were badly equipped, because Hitler considered that supplying them with the latest generation of weapons would be a mistake. The Führer was convinced that the Gallic soldiers would be the first to betray him as soon as the opportunity presented. On November 8, 1942, at 5:30 in the morning, the Anglo-American Army, commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower, landed on the African coast. The Italians and Germans failed to detect the threat in time, and allowed the fleet to reach its target without resistance. In fact, the only inconvenience the ships ran into on their journey was the strong winds from the Mediterranean, which caused several vessels to sink. Dozens of soldiers drowned in the sea long before entering combat. In the following days, the Allies occupied Algeria and Morocco, conquering one by one the main cities of the region. Against all their calculations, they found that the French, far from joining them and turning their backs on Hitler, remained loyal to the Third Reich and the Vichy regime. They fought hard, but the lack of adequate weapons made their resistance break. The course of the war seemed to have changed completely, as the Nazis soon suffered heavy defeats both on the Eastern Front and in Egypt. Hitler was enraged by the news that he had been attacked by surprise. For the Führer, the capture of the main ports and airports in the region was inexcusable. As a consequence, he announced the complete occupation of France, to reinforce that area and prevent his enemies from wanting to enter Germany through Gallic territory. In North Africa, meanwhile, the commander of the French troops was Admiral François Darlan, a soldier loyal to the Vichy government, but who at the same time wanted to avoid the massacre of his men. Through diplomacy, the United States and Great Britain convinced him to leave the Axis and join the Allies. After capitulating and betraying the Nazi fascists, Darlan allowed his new comrades to march on Tunisia. Just a month later, the admiral was shot dead by a young French resistance opponent of the Vichy regime. Hitler was determined to maintain control over the Mediterranean Sea, so, ignoring the advice of his most prestigious officers, he made one of the worst decisions of World War II. Instead of reinforcing German troops fighting in the Soviet Union, he poured huge amounts of resources into Tunisia, hoping to slow the Allied advance. In the long term, this would cause the Wehrmacht to lose the Eastern Front, although in the short term it secured a few victories in North Africa. One of the many generals convinced that that campaign was lost was Erwin Rommel himself, who in any case complied with his orders and fiercely fought the enemies of the Axis. In February 1943, one of the most important battles of those months was fought, the Battle of the Kesserine Pass, where the Afrika Korps humiliated the U.S. Army, whose troops were disorganized and poorly prepared. The Americans, who had 30,000 men, suffered a total of 10,000 casualties, while the 20,000 German soldiers barely lost 2,000. However, the success of the Germans did not last long, and after General Rommel had to withdraw from the front due to health problems, the Allies advanced without mercy. By May 1943, the Axis had already irreversibly lost North Africa. Finally, the United States and England already had a good part of the Mediterranean in their hands, and preparations began to invade Italy through Sicily. The days of the Third Reich were numbered. We reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what would have happened if the Nazis detected Operation Torch in time? Leave us your answer in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.